So that gives you a flavor of the approach that we're adopting at a very high level. Hundreds of hours have been poured into the work so far, which I really can't go into in 15 minutes. But I draw your attention really to the top three, that when you're having a discussion about risk, or where there's a discussion around making choices, if you're not passing the first three tests, that it's unlikely that you have risk information that's good enough for material decision making. And with that, I'll leave that and look for further questions as part of the Q&A. What I want to focus more on is just sort of drawing attention to some of the challenges. The first of which we came across was just complexity of the subject. My predisposition as a consultant is not to be deterred by complexity. If it was simple, someone else would have done it, and I would be out of a job. The challenge here is to make intelligent trade-offs between simplification and loss of quality of the information that we have available to us. And that's, I have to say, it's not an insubstantial task in the context of a biosecurity risk analysis. It's as hard as it gets, if you like. However, that's not an impediment to not having a go at building, the first word, a portfolio view of biosecurity risk. What I've observed in the department is there is no shortage of excellence in building an understanding of risk on a unique basis. And that's evidenced by the IRAs and such are done. What is far more challenging is building a portfolio view, again, based on a standardized unit of measurement of risk. The second challenge is around stakeholders and keeping the assessment free of bias. There is an entire universe of knowledge around bias that creeps into assessment of risk. There is a hierarchy of information that commonly feeds into risk assessment, where we have large bodies of statistically significant information. We can keep bias out of it by just crunching the numbers. It becomes an actuarial exercise. But in the type of risk analysis we're talking about, that is rarely the case, that there is anything like a statistically significant or even a body of data that's appropriate that feeds into the risk assessment. So we are more and more reliant on expert judgment, again, in the areas that Mark talked about, which are of high value to the department. But keeping bias out is a developing skill. And bias can be really influential in the way that stakeholders drive a particular decision in one direction or another. Again, that's a significant challenge for for decision makers. The next challenge is integration of disciplines. What's been a dawning realization is the scientists, economists, or subject matter experts, industry specialists, finance professionals, and operations, not any one group of specialists have the overall wherewithal to build the overall picture, and it requires collaboration between all of them. That whilst a scientist can actually build a narrative around how a pest or disease originates, enters the country, establishes and spreads, we're reliant on the economists and the industry specialists to then answer the so what question. What are the implications if this takes hold? And from then on, asking the bang for buck question involves a conversation with people who drive the machinery of biosecurity in practice, and the management accountants behind the scene who count the dollars, an attribution of those dollars to that activity. Without those four elements, four pieces of insight, again, you don't pass the test on the three chevrons that we're looking at. We've talked about measurement. The other element to this is the social overlay, that whilst the driver behind risk-reward, again, I come back to that expression that sort of coined by Beale in this context, the implication is that it's based on an objective assessment of risk, and in this context, objectivity means the economics and science underpinning those risks. However, practical observation suggests that we are not in an apolitical environment, that in fact, once that basic analysis has been done, the decision makers need to sit back and take a cold, hard look at the environment that we are in and what the implications of that overlay are for the information that we've gathered. That's not to say that the social overlay in all instances trumps the need for doing the hard analysis, anything but it's a recognition that this is a point for some of the complexity to re-enter the discussion, but not completely override some of the strong scientific and economic foundations that underpin our understanding of the risks. The final point is it's a business decision. It needs to adhere to these principles of sound management. And in that, it may well be really a test of business skill to persuade the various stakeholders that the best or the optimal outcome for the country as a whole is based on that blend of criteria that's been taken into account, rather than the science tells me this, therefore I must do that, or politician A says this, therefore I must do that. And this is really the blending of various perspectives in making a risk-adjusted decision really becomes an art. Whilst we begin as a sort of pseudo-scientific basis, it culminates in an art form. And I'm sure there's a few grey hairs and others are in the room who would relate to that. So, having just painted a picture on 6 challenges, and I assure you it's a much longer list when we actually sat down and to build this, they're not insurmountable, and a number of other industries have taken on similar challenges and have come out the other end much the better for it. On the flip side is really the perhaps understated opportunities and strengths that exist within the sort of biosecurity community to take that one step further in building a portfolio view of biosecurity. The quality and depth of current insight into risk is remarkable. That is, if I go into another industry sector, say for example a banking sector, and if I were to compare the depth of insight there is around individual risks, there's nothing really to compare with it. There are some fields where they also operate in a data-rich, they operate in a data-rich environment where they might be comparable. But here, the sheer volume of good information that exists is a real advantage. It's a real source of strength that should be leveraged. In the second part, the capability within the organization, and here what I'm really alluding to is the sort of capabilities that Mark signified and the collaboration that there is with ACERA and the opportunity to draw on those tools and techniques to really go beyond what's commonly accepted as basic risk analysis, multiply the likelihood by the consequence, or do a basic heat map. Those tools and techniques are really important in progressively improving the quality of risk analysis at a portfolio level, and they shouldn't be understated. It's a unique advantage that you have over other sectors and other arenas. The third part is the vehicle to connect various disciplines. And what I mean by that is, if we've been able to tell the story around the risk of concern in a fulsome manner, by default we've created a vehicle for communication between the scientists, the economists, the finance professionals who control the budgets, and operations. In that, in untangling any part of that risk story, you go back to those professionals. And each of those professionals can see what the implication of their contribution to the risk story is to the final value, if you like, that drops out of the analysis. The final point I'd make here is making the decision maker's job more transparent and defensible. And this is really about arming the decision maker in anticipation of needing to go to conversations with other stakeholders who are not armed with this risk information, and be able to be more influential in that discussion to bring them back to what might otherwise be argued as a more reasonable stance around prioritization around biosecurity. And with that in mind, I think when you actually present a biosecurity risk profile, and I apologize, we're not in a position to provide you with that sort of output at this stage, but once those sort of bar charts or other graphics are shared, suddenly the various stakeholders approach the problem in a different way. They're less inclined to come in boots and all and say, look, my opinion counts as much as everyone else, therefore I'll use my force of negotiation to achieve an outcome. And there's slightly more hesitation that results in, well, okay, let's just pause for a minute and digest what we've been offered by the decision maker. There may well then be more bartering and negotiation, but if this portfolio of risk is done in a robust way, then it really puts the decision maker in a very different level of comfort when it comes to attribution, allocation of funding. I might conclude there and take any questions that relate to this afterwards.